It is literally the largest Confederate monument in the world. And it's the largest Confederate monument in the world right on the doorstep of Atlanta. And that is really weird.
They're considered the three greatest heroes of the Confederacy: Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson.
The carving recesses in 42 feet, and each head is about 90 feet tall. So the carving takes in several football fields.
Among all of the monuments or memorials to the Confederacy, Stone Mountain is truly unique.
The Confederate monuments issue is complicated.
In the laws that established the park, it is established as a memorial to the Confederacy.
So a lot of people, when they think about Stone Mountain Park in particular, and the carving, they think that it's a lot older than it is.
The carving was not finished until the early 1970s, so it's really a relatively recent thing.
It's not about the Civil War. It really is about a much more recent period in our nation's past.
After nearly half a century of work, the memorial carving here at Stone Mountain is finally finished, and officials are calling it the eighth wonder of the world.
You know, it's a monument to the Confederacy. It's a monument to people who wanted to succeed because they did not want to live in a country where you could not enslave people.
Besides being a Confederate memorial, it was also the place where the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan came about.
Little children, along with 3,000 robed Klansmen and their women auxiliaries, gather in Georgia, where the society was founded, to initiate into their ranks 700 new members.
I've always been proud of being from the South. I've never shied away from it. But I also have to realize that a lot of the people don't even look at the South being for me. Like, am I considered a Southerner, you know?
Save the money! Save the flags! Save the heritage!
There's nothing hate about it, it's all heritage.
When they say heritage, what is it that they're lifting up?
Heritage is history with all the bad parts left out.
Well, 40% of Southerners were enslaved during the Civil War, and that certainly was not their heritage.
Though we think of Stone Mountain as a Civil War memorial, nothing from the Civil War actually happened there.
This is not a battlefield. This is not a cemetery. This is a relic of a political battle that was lost as surely as the Confederacy lost its war against the United States of America.
The monument, as we know it today, really took shape as a result of Marvin Griffin's campaign for so-called massive resistance to integration.
As long as I am your governor, there will be no breakdown in the pattern of segregation in this state.
But a lot of people just don't even know. They don't understand. They don't understand that Stone Mountain, as well as many Confederate monuments all over this country, were very intentionally placed to keep Black people in their places.
The people who created the carving, that's what they had in mind, and they were very explicit about that.
We didn't come down here to apologize, got it?
They want to erase our history because they want to erase us.
They go to Stone Mountain and they see that sculpture, and they know what it means. They know what it stands for. They know the point of it.
It's not about all the other negative things that are being put in the media. It's about honoring the soldiers who fought for their cause, for their lives, their families.
It is a monument to say that we are a state that believed in the values of the Confederacy.
We should not erase history. At the same time, we don't have to revere that history.
That's a space that's controlled by the state of Georgia, and that's a place that memorializes and gives reverence to people who fought for a version of the country that we reject today.
So every day we wake up and we still have that law in the books is a day where the state of Georgia is reaffirming its commitment to those values.
Does this park, memorializing the Confederacy, represent where we as Georgians want to be in the 21st century? That's what we have to deal with.
Well, my dad had many skills.
Okay, here we go. She'll fall right in here.
But he wasn't an artist in the fact that he sculptured anything prior to working on Stone Mountain.
We will now establish this point from Jefferson Davis's hand over to Robert E. Lee's hand.
Once he became the chief carver, he kept a diary every day, along with 8x10 glossy black and white photos, where he showed what happened each and every day on that mountain. Daddy invested all of his 8 years, 5 months, and 19 days on the side of that mountain. He risked losing his life on a daily basis.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to come and share my dad's legacy with you.
Just like I think Daddy was destined to complete that carving, I think I'm destined to share about him completing that carving.
Every day, Daddy raised and lowered a Confederate flag. And unfortunately, I do not have one single flag.
And I want people to value that carving because I want them to value my dad's life and all the other men who risked their life to accomplish such a gigantic masterpiece.
Stone Mountain is a place where we can think about the memory of the Civil War. It's not really where we go to think about the history of the Civil War because nothing from the Civil War happened there. It's really about the way in which the war was memorialized.
Defeat came as an almost unimaginable shock for the true believers in the Confederate cause. They had gone to war thinking that victory was inevitable. And now they're looking at a situation where they've endured all this suffering, all this devastation, the grief of their sons and fathers and brothers having been killed and maimed. And people are looking around and saying, what is the reason? There must be a reason. And the reason they came up with was, well, we didn't really lose.
And a very different narrative about what the war was about emerged from the perspective of the losers of that war, from white Southerners.
I was in high school before I learned really that the South had lost the Civil War because the way everybody talked about it, we'd won it.
Now, the Confederates say we did lose militarily, but in the process, we won a moral victory. So how can you say that there's anything wrong with that? Just because you won, the Confederates say, that doesn't mean you were right. So this is what we call the myth of the lost cause.
When Edward Pollard writes his book called The Lost Cause, he's already reinterpreting the Civil War, and he says what the war did not decide, the Southern people still cling to. And he meant Southern white people. So they were clinging to those symbols that they felt represented a just cause.
It was a myth and not the truth of what happened in this state or in the South.
Now, mind you, in this whole thing of the lost cause, we're not really talking about emancipation here. It's almost as if African Americans and that whole experience didn't happen.
That lost cause myth also was to directly intimidate Black people living in the South.
Stone Mountain is a emblem of that mythology and of that kind of history being written by the losers.
Davis, Lee, and Jackson become the sort of holy trinity of the lost cause, and that's why they're on the side of Stone Mountain.
The intention was to weaponize art in support of a false ideology.
So whether it's a flag or a street name or it's a monument, it's all imbued with that.
It creates a field of fear, and I don't understand why anybody would want to create that type of culture.
Confederates say it wasn't about slavery. All we were doing was standing up for our rights as guaranteed in the Constitution. It was about state rights.
Yeah, it was about states' right, the right of a state to allow slavery. The truth is that the war was fought for slavery. Slavery was an inhumane and a cruel institution.
And so Stone Mountain is a monument and allegiance to individuals who believed that that was okay, that you could have individuals enslaved. We must recognize what that means. It means that we have an allegiance to individuals who were inhumane, who fought. Yes, they fought, they did. They fought valiantly to hold on to an inhumane system. And that's something that we cannot celebrate.
This great organization known as the Ku Klux Klan.
Burn, nigger, burn.
Nigger, burn, nigger.
Listen, South has a long history in race, and to a large part, race was from the very first of the founding of Georgia. And we have to recognize that. Georgia was founded as a non-slave state. That needs to be taught. That needs to be taught that there was a good portion of Georgia that did not agree with secession. I had a great-grandfather who fought for the Confederacy, but I also had another great-grandfather from the same community that fought for the Union. We simply have tried to twist history toward one view. Well, lay it all out and let folks tell the true story, but we're not telling the true story. Now, we're certainly not telling it at Stone Mountain.
Today, Stone Mountain is one of the most visited of all parks in Georgia.
It's this beautiful landscape that really is unmatched. People use the park. They use it for recreation, for picnics, for getting out with the family.
But it's also this bizarre entertainment center that has, dinosaurs and a train going around it and golf course and conference center. It is no longer a monument to the Confederacy. In reality, it's a theme park.
But you still have that looming in the background, that memorialization, that purpose for which the park was purchased by the state.
Stone Mountain was already a tourist attraction even before the Civil War. So it seemed like a natural place to put a monument because everyone would see it there.
The founding force behind Stone Mountain was Helen Plain, a Confederate widow. And she thought that Stone Mountain would be the perfect place to have a massive carving. And she was part of this whole United Daughters of the Confederacy movement to memorialize the Confederacy.
The United Daughters of the Confederacy began as a way for the wives and mothers of Confederate soldiers to keep their graves clean.
Soon after the war and into the 1870s, most of the monuments were about commemorating the dead. So they're in cemeteries, relatively private places.
And then after Reconstruction ends and federal troops are no longer in the region, the building of Confederate monuments takes on a different tone.
When you look historically at the timeline and when Confederate monuments were being erected, it was after the failing of Reconstruction.
There's a lot of racial violence. There's an epidemic of lynching.
And when we started to see the separate but equal and Jim Crow policies begin to be enacted, these moments were inspiration for the creation of more than 700 Confederate monuments nationwide.
And they go into very public places, courthouse squares, main streets, places where you can't miss them.
And there were monuments that showed that the people who had lost the war were now back in charge.
And more than that, to enshrine the landscape with their heroes and with their claim of truth. But what really taints Stone Mountain is its association with the Ku Klux Klan.
William Joseph Simmons, one-time salesman of ladies' garters, in this rare newsreel film, leads his followers up Stone Mountain in Georgia for the first initiation ceremony of the reincarnated Klan.
There was a movie called Birth of a Nation that came out that really resurrected the Ku Klux Klan.
And this is the inspiration for the group of men from Atlanta who go up to the top of Stone Mountain and declare that the Ku Klux Klan is now reformed, and they burn a cross to mark the occasion.
It's just fascinating to see how these two issues are related.
Sam Venable, who owned the mountain, was one of the original members. And Helen Plain even suggested that some figures of the Ku Klux Klan should be included.
So she started fundraising around it. She got people involved. She got Gutzen Borglum involved.
Gutzen Borglum was the original carver, later carved Mount Rushmore. So it was a big project. It was a popular project, and it was nationally popular. There was national support from white people across the country for this carving effort.
So by 1925, Borglum had only gotten as far as carving the head of Lee in profile onto the side of the mountain. Bottom line is, the Confederate Memorial Association fires him. Then they turn right around and they hire another sculptor by the name of Augustus Lukeman. Now, Lukeman starts over again, but it's a slightly smaller scale, and it's just below the unfinished head of Lee, which Lukeman has blasted off the side of the mountain. In any event, by 1928, the association was out of money, out of options, because the 12-year lease on the carving site was up.
And so all carving efforts ceased.
And at this point in 1928, it was considered something of a public embarrassment because they hadn't been able to finish it.
I remember quite well my mother and father having very tense discussions about whether or not we should go to Stone Mountain. My mother was, in a social club, and they like to have picnics and what have you. And so when our club decided they wanted to host a family picnic at Stone Mountain, my father refused. He says, "I'm not going to Stone Mountain." And he says, "That's where the Klan organized." As a kid, you don't quite understand because our parents kept us very sheltered from the kind of vestiges of segregation. But it was clear that my father, who had grown up in Vidalia, Georgia, had moved to Atlanta, who had served in the Navy, had very strong opinions about what it meant to be black in a segregated society, and to what certain symbols meant. And so the symbolism of Stone Mountain, not just the monument, but just the idea of my mother wanting to take her children to Stone Mountain for an excursion, for something that was fun, he found that to be just terribly disturbing, because when he thought of Stone Mountain, he thought of the Klan.
last vestige of states' rights guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the Constitution is gone. The second reconstruction of the South is now underway.
In 1954, 57 days after the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, Marvin Griffin, who was running for governor of Georgia, made a campaign promise to buy Stone Mountain and restart the carving.
The Stone Mountain that we know today is really a story about civil rights and the era of civil rights, when Georgia and other states throughout the South and the Deep South were going through a period of intense reaction to efforts to transform the segregated South.
Segregation was about oppressing Black people and keeping people separate. Brown versus Board ruled that separate but equal is literally not possible. So segregation was acceptance of a system that kept people separate and kept them inherently unequal.
That was the political impetus that gave rise to a renewed effort to remember a certain version of the Civil War and to commemorate it and to finish this carving that had been started half a century earlier.
The fight against integration really relit the fire under the Stone Mountain carving project.
And I know that there's a lot of people who think that the Confederacy and this monument represent their heritage. But what I like to remind people is that when we're talking about what this monument represents, it represents massive resistance to federally mandated integration.
They used the Confederacy as their symbol, a rallying cry to oppose the federal government.
There are all kinds of legislation that's being passed in response to the Supreme Court's decision. And one of the things that the legislature is also doing is putting the Confederate battle emblem on the state flag.
To kind of assert their claim of state rights and the right of self-determination, because that's what they felt the Confederate cause was about.
They were clinging to those symbols that they felt represented a just cause. But it's now a battle in a different context, a battle against civil rights, a battle to maintain white supremacy.
So from 1956 through 2001, the Confederate battle flag remained on the Georgia state flag, even during the Olympics, and even with all the efforts that have been made to remove it.
While I was governor, I took the Confederate battle emblem off the Georgia flag, which was about 3/4 of the flag. After you looked into the history and considered it, how could you have a state symbol where 1/3 of the population was offended by it? The backlash was the most overwhelming thing I've ever seen. I thought we were over the issue of race by 2001, and we were not. And it taught me that race was just under the surface in many of the things that we consider as to being progress and prosperity.
In the political bargain that came with changing the state flag came the legal stipulation that Confederate monuments in the state of Georgia, explicitly calling out Stone Mountain, could not be removed or altered in any way.
It started probably when I first went to a Decatur protest. I think it was my first protest ever, and it was about the Confederate obelisk. I walked by it all the time. Like, I never realized that it was a Confederate monument until Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights began passing out flyers. That obelisk was, put there during a time when the South and people in power in the South were putting up all types of Confederate monuments in public spaces. And so how can you tell me that that's not in direct correlation to trying to intimidate Black Southerners, It's perfectly okay to say that you're proud of where you come from and talk about your roots here. But at the same time, if your history is also linked to the direct traumas and pains of a whole other group of people who also live in the South and also have roots in the South, then you should consider why that is disrespectful to put up monuments and wear Confederate flag memorabilia all the time. When I got the call that they were removing the monument, I could not believe that they had actually listened to us. I realized that this was just the first step of me continuing that effort to create a more united America, that I wanted to see a better future. But if you want that, you have to get involved in advocacy work.
The history of the Civil War and the way it's been remembered has always been a part of the way we have fought over race and equality in this country, and it remains so today.
For 160 years, the narrative has been the white narrative of the Civil War.
Every day the sun comes up over that mountain, the state is declaring it a monument to the Confederacy.
That's historical. That Confederate memorial will be there because the people back in those days who cared enough about their families wanted to honor them.
I think that if we want to create a world that is actually accepting, you would understand why that's unacceptable.
Sure, there's good, bad, and ugly in every story. We just need to continue to focus on the good and not the bad.
Now, you can make a lot of good, credible arguments for a lot of different solutions for Stone Mountain, but any of those absolutely comes with the obligation to have a honest historical reckoning with how that monument got there and what it represents.
The truth needs to be told about the meaning and the intent of these memorials.
Also, the harm that has been created and felt by Black Americans.
That is a difficult truth, but it is a truth that must be confronted.
Most people, once they really understood the history behind that monument, would say, oh yeah, I better understand now why.
We can't let it continue to be, which it has been for decades, is a shrine, not only to the lost cause, but also to much more pernicious, far-right, racist organizations.
We gotta deal with this. And we gotta deal with it in an open and honest way.
All Georgians have a stake in this issue.
Right now, the carving is explicitly protected by Georgia law.
And the fact that the state of Georgia still has this direct connection to Stone Mountain does create a higher burden.
But I like to think of that as an opportunity to have that historical reckoning that we need.
So it's important to come together and talk about these things and be ready to be emotional and angry.
And so these are tense conversations, but there are conversations that must be had.
Well, I just don't like it when you start dealing with history. You start wanting to erase it. You want to change it. It was important then, and it should still stay important today.
We're not talking about erasing history.
We're talking about enormous issues in our country about our racial divide and our political divide through the context of a Confederate monument.
This really speaks to how complicated this issue is.
These are the core issues that we have always had since the founding of the nation.
And so as a nation, we have to admit that yes, our country was built upon the backs of people who were enslaved. And that enslavement came from ideologies that were very racist ideologies. We have to admit that. We cannot live out the ideals that we say represent who we are as a people. There's no way we can do that. unless we're willing to listen to each other.
I think that that's so vital for an ideal nation, you know, an ideal society.
And until we use historic places to foster truth, education, reconciliation, and healing, then we are not harnessing the full power of our historic built environment, the power of art, and what it communicates about who we once were, but also who we are in the present and who we want to be in the future.
So this comes from the Official Code of Georgia 50-3-1C. Any other provision of law notwithstanding, the memorial to the heroes of the Confederate States of America, graven upon the face of Stone Mountain, shall never be altered, removed, concealed, or obscured in any fashion, and shall be preserved and protected for all time as a tribute to the bravery and heroism of the citizens of this state who suffered and died in their cause. There is no clearer statement of the lost cause anywhere than is here and codified in Georgia law.